Hello again, Lucas. The wine glass slipped from Lucas Bennett's fingers, red liquid spreading across the white tablecloth like spilled blood. 12 years. 12 years since he'd heard that voice, seen those eyes that once looked at him with love, instead of this cold, measured stare. Elena stood in the doorway of his dining room, wearing a simple navy dress that somehow made her look more elegant than any of the society women he'd dated since. Her dark hair was pulled back in a way that revealed the sharp intelligence in her eyes, eyes that had once softened when they looked at him, that had once believed he was capable of being the man she deserved. For a moment, Lucas wondered if he was hallucinating. The face was older, more refined, but unmistakably hers. Behind her, a boy with familiar dark hair and Elena's intelligent eyes stepped forward. The resemblance to Lucas was subtle, but undeniable, the same stubborn jawline, the same way of holding his shoulders when nervous. "Dad," the boy said, and Lucas felt the world tilt sideways. "I'm Jordan, your son." The words hit Lucas like a physical blow. His hands gripped the edge of the mahogany table, the same table where he'd once planned a future that didn't include the woman standing before him, didn't include the child who was now looking at him with curiosity instead of anger. The table where he'd signed contracts worth millions while avoiding the one signature that would have acknowledged his greatest responsibility. "I don't understand," Lucas whispered, his voice barely audible above the grandfather clock ticking in the corner. The same clock that had counted down the minutes while he'd made the worst decision of his life, while he'd chosen cowardice over courage. "How did you find you?" Elena's voice carried the weight of years of sleepless nights, of decisions made in desperation, and strength found in solitude. "Jordan found you. He won the scholarship competition your company sponsors. Impressive, isn't it? Your son is brilliant." The pride in her voice was unmistakable, the pride of a mother who had watched her child overcome obstacles that should have been insurmountable. The word son hung in the air between them. Lucas stared at the boy, at Jordan, seeing his own stubborn chin, his mother's graceful hands, a face that was both familiar and foreign. This child had grown up without him, had learned to walk, to read, to dream, while Lucas had convinced himself that walking away was the right choice. Had taken first steps into arms that weren't his, had asked questions Lucas would never answer, had needed comfort Lucas had never provided. 12 years ago. Elena continued, her voice steady, but her hands trembling slightly, as she set down the cake. She'd brought a simple chocolate cake that looked homemade, the kind of gesture that spoke of love and tradition. "You told me I was a mistake, a complication. You said your reputation was worth more than whatever we had together." She paused, and Lucas saw the young woman she'd been brilliant, hopeful in love with a man who was too much of a coward to love her back. "Tonight Jordan convinced me to come here. He said it was time for us to meet face to face." Jordan stepped closer to the table, his young face serious beyond his years. "I called your assistant and told her I was your son. She didn't believe me at first, but when I told her about the scar on your left hand, and how you always tap your pen 3 times before signing documents, things I learned from watching your interviews, she let me make an appointment. I said it was a family emergency." Lucas stared at his son in amazement. The boy had found a way to reach him that was both clever and completely innocent. Jordan stepped closer to the table, his young face serious beyond his years. In his features, Lucas could see the ghost of the child. He might have raised the bedtime stories. He might have read the scraped knees he might have bandaged. "I know what happened, Dad. I know you left when Mom needed you most. But I also know people can change. That's why I'm here, Lucas felt something breaking inside his chest walls. He'd built justifications, he'd clung to the careful life he'd constructed on the foundation of abandoning the people who mattered most. The boy was giving him a chance he didn't deserve, offering a grace he'd never shown. Standing in his dining room was living proof of his greatest failure and his most profound loss. "I thought about this moment for years," Elena said quietly, her eyes scanning the expensive furnishings, the artwork, the symbols of success that had cost him everything that mattered. "What I would say if I ever saw you again, how I would make you understand what you did to us." She looked at Jordan, and her expression softened with a love so deep it made Lucas's chest ache. "But my son taught me something. He said sometimes people don't run away because they don't care. Sometimes they run because they're scared of caring too much." In that moment, Lucas realized that everything he'd gained, the corner office, with its view of the city, the expensive car that impressed clients, the respect of colleagues who didn't really know him, the invitations to galas where he smiled and charmed and felt hollow inside, all of it paled next to what he'd lost. This woman had raised their child alone, had become someone magnificent. Without him, had taught their son to be kinder than his father had ever been. The silence stretched between them, filled with 12 years of unspoken words, unanswered questions, and the steady rhythm of 3 hearts beating in the same room for the first time. Lucas looked at his son, truly looked at him, and saw a future he'd thrown away, a love he'd been too frightened to claim, a family he'd never allowed himself to believe he deserved. Sometimes the hardest truths come wrapped in the voices of the people we thought we'd left behind. What happens when the past refuses to stay buried, when the children we abandon grow up to teach us who we should have been? Stay with us as this father faces the consequences of his choices. The story began 13 years ago in a different world, one where Elena Reyes was 20 years old, working as a housekeeper in Lucas Bennett's penthouse while putting herself through Columbia University. She would arrive at dawn with her textbooks hidden in her cleaning supplies, stealing moments between polishing marble countertops to study molecular biology, her fingers moving between chemical formulas and dusting solutions with equal precision. Lucas was 29, then already making millions in private equity, already believing his own press about being untouchable. He lived in a world of tailored suits and power lunches of decisions that moved markets and deals that made headlines. His penthouse was a shrine to success, floor-to-ceiling windows, imported furniture art that cost more than most people made in a year. It was a space designed to impress, not to live in. He noticed Elena not because she was beautiful, though she was, with her dark eyes that seemed to see everything, and her quiet grace as she moved through his space, but because she was reading Dostoevsky while waiting for his laundry to finish. In a world where most people in his life were either trying to impress him or get something from him, here was someone completely absorbed in something that had nothing to do with him. Crime and punishment. He'd said that first Tuesday morning, finding her curled in his kitchen chair, her uniform neat despite the early hour, her textbooks spread across his granite countertop. "Heavy reading for 6 a.m. Heavy living requires heavy reading," she'd replied without looking up, her voice carrying a slight accent that spoke of family roots in Puerto Rico, of dreams that crossed language barriers. "Raskolnikov thinks he's above ordinary morality." Sound familiar? That was the moment. Not when she smiled at him weeks later. Not when she let him take her to dinner at places his friends would never see them. Not when she first stayed the night, and he woke to find her reading in his bed, sunlight streaming across her bare shoulders. The moment she called him out with such quiet precision that he felt seen for the first time in his life, stripped of his armor, and found wanting. They fell in love in stolen hours, her between classes, and work him between board meetings and charity galas where he performed the role of the eligible bachelor. Elena would quiz him on literature while he helped her with statistics, homework, her mind quick enough to make connections that left him breathless. She talked about chemical bonds while teaching him to make coffee, the way her grandmother had shown her strong and sweet, and served in cups that had traveled from San Juan to New York in a suitcase held together with hope. Lucas found himself canceling dinner meetings just to watch Elena study, mesmerized by the way she chewed her pencil when concentrating the soft Spanish words she whispered when frustrated with equations. He bought her favorite coffee beans, expensive ones she'd mentioned admiring but could never afford, and left them in the kitchen without explanation. When she thanked him, blushing, he pretended not to know what she meant. Their first real conversation lasted until sunrise. Elena had been studying for organic chemistry while waiting for the washing machine to finish, and Lucas found himself drawn to her intensity. She explained molecular structures with such passion that Lucas understood for the first time why she cleaned his floors. With the same care she brought to her laboratory work, both were about creating order from chaos, finding beauty in precision. "You see this differently than I do," he'd said, watching her sketch benzene rings on a napkin. "Like it's alive." "It is alive," Elena replied, her eyes lighting up with the fervor of someone who'd found her calling. "Every reaction tells a story. Every bond is a choice. Chemistry is just love at the molecular level, elements finding what completes them." That's when Lucas knew he was lost, not just attracted to her beauty or impressed by her intelligence, but genuinely irreversibly in love with the way her mind worked, the way she found wonder in test tubes and equations. "I want to be a professor," she told him one evening as they watched the sunset from his terrace, the city spread below them like a promise. She was wearing one of his shirts, her hair loose around her shoulders, and Lucas thought he'd never seen anything more beautiful than this brilliant woman who saw potential in test tubes and lecture halls. "I want to teach kids who look like me that science isn't just for other people, that we belong in laboratories and lecture halls, that our minds can unlock secrets that change the world." Lucas pulled her closer, breathing in the scent of her shampoo mixed with the cleaning supplies she could never quite wash from her hands. A combination that should have been unpleasant, but instead smelled like home, like belonging, like a life he'd never known he wanted. "You'll change the world," he said, and meant it. For a brief shining moment, he could see it, Elena in a lab coat commanding respect, their children playing in university hallways, while she shaped the next generation of scientists. But fantasies shatter when they meet reality, and reality came in the form of Lucas's carefully constructed world pressing against this bubble of happiness they'd created. The pregnancy test appeared on a Thursday morning in March, rain drumming against the windows of his penthouse like an ominous soundtrack. Elena stood in his bathroom doorway, her face pale but determined, holding the plastic stick like it contained both their futures. She'd been quiet for days, and Lucas had assumed it was stress from midterms from the pressure of working 2 jobs while maintaining a perfect GPA. "We're having a baby," she said simply, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. Lucas felt the world narrow to a pinpoint. Every corporate crisis, every million-dollar decision, every moment of pressure he'd ever faced disappeared next to those 4 words. His mind immediately jumped to damage control, the board of directors who trusted him to be stable and predictable, the country club where his parents held lifetime memberships, the society pages that chronicled his every move, the investors who saw him as a safe bet, the clients who trusted him with their fortunes, because he represented everything they understood about success and propriety. "Are you sure?" The question came out wrong, loaded with hope for the wrong answer, and he saw Elena flinch as if he'd struck her. "I'm sure." Elena sat on the edge of his bed, still in her cleaning uniform, the starched fabric a reminder of the divide between their worlds. "I know this complicates things, Lucas. I know I'm not the kind of woman you're supposed to be with. But this baby is ours." She placed her hand on her still flat stomach, with a tenderness that made Lucas's chest tight. "This baby is love made real." The way she said ours broke something in him. Not because he didn't love her, he did desperately, completely, with a ferocity that scared him, but because loving her meant choosing her, and choosing her meant disappointing everyone else. His father, who'd spent decades building the Bennett name into something synonymous with old money and older values. His colleagues, who'd already started asking pointed questions about why he never brought dates to company events. The investors who trusted him with their money because he represented stability, tradition, everything they understood. "What do you want to do?" He asked the coward's question, the question that put the burden on her shoulders instead of his. Elena's eyes filled with tears. She refused to let fall her pride intact, even as her heart was breaking. "I want to keep our baby. I want us to be a family. I know it's not what you planned, but Lucas, when I hold this child, I'll see your eyes. When they laugh, I'll hear your laugh. This isn't a mistake. This is love made real." That was the first crack in the wall Lucas had built around his heart. Elena believed in him in a future where love conquered the careful calculations that had ruled his life. But Lucas had spent too many years building walls, too many years believing that reputation was more valuable than relationships, that what other people thought mattered more than what he felt. The next 2 weeks were agony. Lucas went through the motions of his life board meetings, client dinners, strategy sessions, while Elena continued working, continued studying her hand, occasionally drifting to her still flat stomach. She brought him coffee in the mornings and hummed while she worked old songs her grandmother had sung, and Lucas realized she was already planning their life together, already making room in her dreams for sleepless nights and first steps and school plays. Meanwhile, Lucas was fielding calls from his father about a merger that could make or break the company from his assistant, about the annual investors' gala, where appearances mattered more than truth from his mother, about why he seemed so distracted lately, so unlike the son she'd raised to value image above all else. The weight of other people's expectations pressed down on him until he could barely breathe, until Elena's gentle humming felt like a lifeline he was too afraid to grab. The breaking point came on a rainy Tuesday that would haunt Lucas for the rest of his life. His father arrived unannounced, settling into the leather chair in Lucas's home office with the gravity of a man delivering a verdict. Charles Bennett had built his fortune through careful calculation and ruthless pragmatism, and he'd raised his son to understand that personal desires were luxuries that successful men couldn't afford. But the pressure had been building for weeks. Lucas's assistant had started asking pointed questions about Elena's extended hours. His mother had called twice, wondering why he'd declined invitations to 3 charity galas where eligible socialites would be present. Board members exchanged glances when his mind wandered during meetings, when he checked his phone for texts from Elena instead of focusing on million-dollar acquisitions. The night before his father's visit, Lucas had received a call from his college roommate, now a partner at a competing firm. "Heard you're slumming it with the help," David had said, with the casual cruelty of old money. "Hope you're being careful, man. You know how these girls can be looking for a meal ticket." Lucas had hung up furious, but the seed of doubt was planted. What if everyone saw Elena the way David did? What if his love was just naivety, his trust just stupidity? "Son," Charles Bennett said quietly, his voice carrying the weight of generations of Bennett's success. "I have heard rumors about you and the cleaning girl." Lucas's blood turned to ice. He'd been so careful, so discreet, but apparently not careful enough. In a world where information was currency, someone had noticed the way he looked at Elena, the way she stayed later than the other staff, the subtle signs of intimacy that he'd thought were invisible. "What kind of rumors?" Lucas asked, though he already knew the answer, already felt the walls of his carefully constructed life closing in. "The kind that could destroy everything we've built," his father replied, his tone matter-of-fact, as if he were discussing quarterly reports instead of his son's heart. "The Whitmore account is already asking questions. The Ashfords have pulled their recommendation for the club. People talk, Lucas. They watch. And right now, they're watching you make choices that could ruin us all." Charles leaned forward, his expression softening slightly. "I know you think you love her son. But love is a luxury we can't afford. The Bennett name means something. It opens doors, builds trust, creates opportunities. Are you really willing to throw that away for a girl who cleans toilets?" That night, Elena made dinner in his kitchen like she had dozens of times before. She'd bought ingredients with her grocery money, had planned something special to celebrate the baby, to celebrate them. Lucas watched her move through his space, with such familiarity, such belonging, and felt the future he wanted war with the future he was supposed to have. "I've been thinking about names," Elena said, as she served him pasta with a sauce that smelled like home, like Sunday dinners, and family traditions he'd never experienced. "For a girl, maybe Sophia, after my grandmother. She taught me that women could be strong and soft, at the same time that love was the most powerful force in the universe." She smiled shyly, her hand resting on her stomach. "For a boy, maybe Charles, after your father. I know family matters to you." The irony cut deep. Elena was offering to honor the man who'd just threatened to destroy her, was trying to build bridges to a family that would never accept her. She was choosing love over pride, while Lucas was choosing pride over love, choosing the approval of people who would never truly know him over the woman who saw his soul. That's when he said the words that would haunt him for 12 years. "This was a mistake, Elena. We were a mistake." What happens when fear becomes stronger than love? We're about to witness the devastating cost of cowardice. Elena's fork clattered to her plate, the sound echoing in Lucas's dining room like a gunshot. For a moment, time seemed suspended. The candles Lucas had lit for his birthday dinner flickered, casting shadows that danced across 3 faces, frozen in shock. The expensive crystal, the polished silver, the carefully arranged flowers, all of it seemed obscene, now symbols of a life built on the foundation of abandoning the people who had mattered most. A mistake. Elena's voice was barely a whisper, but it cut through the silence like a blade. "Is that what you told yourself for 12 years? Is that the story that helped you sleep at night?" Jordan looked between his parents, his young face struggling to process the weight of adult pain. He'd known this moment would be difficult, had prepared himself for anger and hurt. But the raw devastation in his mother's voice was more than his 12-year-old heart could fully comprehend. "Mom, maybe we should. No." Elena stood her chair, scraping against the hardwood floor with a sound that seemed to tear through the careful civility of the moment. "No, Jordan. Your father needs to hear this. All of it." Her voice grew stronger, fueled by 12 years of suppressed anger and pain. "He needs to understand what his mistake cost us." Lucas felt his throat close. He'd prepared for many things over the years, hostile takeovers where millions hung in the balance board revolts that could destroy careers, market crashes that wiped out fortunes, but he'd never prepared for this moment. Never prepared to face the woman he'd destroyed, while their son watched, never imagined having to confront the human cost of his cowardice. You want to know about mistakes, Lucas? Elena's voice grew stronger, fueled by 12 years of carrying the weight of his abandonment. The mistake was believing you when you said you loved me. The mistake was thinking that what we had was real, that the man who held me in the dark was the same one who existed in the light. She walked to the window, her reflection ghost-like in the dark glass, and Lucas was struck by how elegant she looked despite the pain radiating from her. This wasn't the broken young woman he'd left behind. This was someone who had been forged in fire and emerged stronger, someone who had transformed into determination. I was 3 months pregnant when you had security escort me out of your building. She continued, her voice steady, now controlled with the precision of someone who had relived this moment countless times. 3 months pregnant when you changed the locks on your apartment, when I came back to collect my things and found strangers living the life I'd thought we were building together. 3 months pregnant when your lawyer served me papers, threatening a restraining order if I ever contacted you again. Lucas felt the blood drain from his face. He'd forgotten about the lawyer had blocked out the clinical cruelty of those final weeks. But Elena remembered everything, every detail, every humiliation, every moment when his fear had transformed into active cruelty. I lived in my car for 2 weeks. She continued, turning back to face him, and Lucas saw Jordan's eyes widen with shock and pain. A pregnant college student with nowhere to go because the man who claimed to love me decided I was too inconvenient to exist. Do you know what it feels like to wake up every morning wondering if today is the day you'll lose everything? To be so hungry that you steal packets of crackers from gas stations because you can't afford food and prenatal vitamins? Ouch! Jordan reached for his mother's hand, his young face pale with understanding. He'd known they'd struggled, but the details, the systematic cruelty, the calculated erasure, those were new wounds opening in real time. Lucas watched his son learn the true cost of his father's cowardice and felt something die inside his chest. "Mom," Jordan whispered, his voice breaking. Elena squeezed her son's fingers, but kept her eyes locked on Lucas. "You want to know what happened after you threw us away? I gave birth to your son in a county hospital alone. The nurses asked where the father was, and I told them he was dead. It felt like the truth." Her voice cracked slightly, and Lucas heard the echo of that terrified young woman she'd been. I held Jordan for the first time and looked into his eyes, your eyes, and realized that I would rather die than let him grow up thinking he wasn't worth fighting for. The words hit Lucas like physical blows. He'd pictured Elena moving on, finding someone better, building a life that didn't include the ghost of him. He'd convinced himself that his abandonment had been a gift, that he'd freed her to find happiness with someone more worthy. He'd never imagined the reality, the poverty, the isolation, the daily choice to survive when survival seemed impossible. But here's what you didn't count on, Lucas. Elena's voice took on a different quality, something Lucas had never heard before, triumph mixed with steel. You thought you were throwing away garbage. Instead, you threw away gold. She turned from the window, and Lucas saw something in her face that stopped his breath. This wasn't the young woman he'd abandoned, the girl who had cleaned his floors and believed in his potential. This was someone who had been tested by fire and emerged as something magnificent. "Tell him, Mom," Jordan said quietly, his voice filled with pride that cut through the pain. "Tell him what you became." Elena smiled at her son, and for the first time since entering the room, her expression softened with pure love. I finished my degree while pregnant, Jordan growing in my belly, while I studied for finals. Graduated summa cum laude 6 months after he was born, pumping breast milk between chemistry labs. Her voice grew stronger with each word. Got my master's in biochemistry while working 3 jobs, then my PhD in molecular genetics while Jordan slept in my arms because I couldn't afford childcare. I'm Dr. Reyes, now Lucas. Professor Reyes. I run the largest genetics research lab on the East Coast. The room tilted around Lucas. This was impossible. Elena had been a housekeeper, a student struggling to pay rent. She couldn't have, but even as his mind rejected it, he knew it was true. He could see it in the way she carried herself in the confidence that had replaced the desperate love she'd once shown him. The Reyes-Morrison gene therapy trials. Elena continued watching recognition dawn in Lucas's eyes like a sunrise of understanding and regret. You've heard of them, haven't you? The breakthrough treatment for childhood leukemia that's been in all the medical journals, the research that saved hundreds of children's lives. That's my work, Lucas. That's what the woman you threw away accomplished. Lucas's mouth went dry. He had heard of the trials, had even considered investing in the biotech company behind them. The lead researcher was a Dr. E. Reyes, but he'd never imagined, never connected the dots. While he'd been moving money around, Elena had been moving mountains. Do you know what it's like? Elena said, her voice taking on the cadence of someone who'd rehearsed this conversation in her mind countless times, to hold a dying child's hand and promise their parents you'll find a way to save them, to work 18-hour days, because every minute you waste is another minute that child doesn't have. She moved closer to the table, and Lucas could see the fire in her eyes, the passion that had driven her to impossible achievements. I named my first successful trial after you, Lucas. The Bennett Protocol. Not because I wanted to honor you, but because I wanted to prove that something good could come from the worst pain I'd ever experienced. Jordan's eyes widened. Even he hadn't known this detail, this connection between his parents that had lived on in his mother's work. Every child I've saved, Elena continued, her voice growing stronger. I saved partly because you taught me that I couldn't depend on anyone else to fight for what mattered. You taught me that love without courage is just pretty words. So I learned to be courageous for other people's children, since I couldn't depend on courage for my own. The weight of her words settled over the room like dust after an explosion. Lucas realized that his abandonment hadn't just hurt Elena and Jordan. It had been transformed into fuel for saving lives, for becoming the kind of person who kept promises he'd been too weak to make. 12 years, Elena said, moving closer to the table, and Lucas could see the steel in her spine, the strength that had carried her through impossible odds. 12 years of 18-hour days of studying, while Jordan slept, of choosing between textbooks and groceries, of proving to everyone, including myself, that the woman you discarded was worth more than you ever imagined. Jordan stood and moved to his mother's side, his chin raised with pride that made Lucas's chest ache with regret. My mom saves lives, Dad. Kids who were going to die, she gives them a future. She's a hero. The word hung between them, a judgment that cut Lucas to his core. While he'd been making money, Elena had been making miracles. While he'd been climbing social ladders that led nowhere, she'd been climbing impossible mountains with their son strapped to her back, proving that love was stronger than fear, that determination could overcome any obstacle. I didn't come here for your approval, Elena said, her voice gentle, now almost kind. I came because Jordan asked me to, because your son, our son, has a capacity for forgiveness that neither of us deserve. Sometimes the children we abandon grow up to teach us what we should have been. But can a father earn the title 12 years too late? Can love bridge the gap between what was lost and what might still be found? Jordan stepped forward, his small hands steady as he pulled a worn envelope from his jacket pocket. The paper was soft, with age creased from countless foldings, and refoldings yellowed at the edges like a historical document. Lucas recognized his own letterhead from 12 years ago, expensive cream stationery that now looked obscene in a child's hands, a reminder of the power he'd wielded against the innocent. "I found this in Mom's jewelry box when I was 9. Jordan said quietly, his voice carrying a weight that no child should have to bear. "It's the letter your lawyer sent her. The one that said if she ever tried to contact you again, you'd have her arrested." His fingers traced the edges of the paper with the reverence of someone handling something precious and terrible. "I wasn't supposed to see it, but I was looking for a birthday present to give Mom. And instead, I found the reason she sometimes looked sad on happy days." Elena's face went pale, her hand reaching out instinctively toward her son. "Jordan, you weren't supposed to. I know, Mom." Jordan's voice was calm, but carried the hurt of a child trying to understand adult cruelty. "But I needed to understand why you worked so hard, why you never talked about my dad. So I started asking questions." Lucas felt the ground shifting beneath him. This wasn't about stalking. This was about a child piecing together his own story. "I researched you online," Jordan continued. "Public records, news articles, company websites. I found pictures of you at charity events. I learned about your company. When Mom had to fill out emergency contact forms for school, I saw your name listed as my father. That's how I knew for sure." Lucas looked at Elena, who nodded reluctantly. "I never lied to him about who his father was. I just never talked about it. But when he started asking direct questions, I couldn't keep pretending you didn't exist. When I saw there was a scholarship program," Jordan continued, "I thought maybe if I was smart enough, good enough, you might notice me. Not as someone asking for something, but as someone you might be proud of." Jordan's voice grew softer, more vulnerable. "But the more I learned about you, the sadder I became. I found old interviews where you talked about success and achievement. But you never smiled. Not really. I watched you at the scholarship ceremony from across the room before I won, and you looked empty, like you were going through motions." Elena's breath caught. She hadn't known Jordan had seen Lucas before the announcement. "I started coming to events where I knew you'd be." Jordan admitted, his young face serious. "Not close enough for you to notice me, but close enough to watch. I saw you at the Children's Hospital charity auction last year. You donated more money than anyone else, but when they showed pictures of the kids your money would help you left early. You looked like you were going to cry." Lucas felt something break inside his chest. He remembered that night seeing those children's faces, wondering if Jordan looked like any of them, wondering if his son was healthy, happy, loved. "I followed you to the parking garage that night," Jordan continued quietly. "I watched you sit in your car for an hour, just sitting there. I think you were crying, but I couldn't tell for sure. I wanted to knock on your window to tell you it was okay, that I was okay, but I was scared you'd drive away again." Elena's eyes filled with tears as she watched her son reveal the depth of his longing, the careful way he'd tried to understand a father who was a stranger. "There were other times, too," Jordan said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I saw you at the coffee shop near Mom's work 3 different times. You never went in, just sat in your car watching the building. I think you were hoping to see her, but you were too afraid to try." Lucas closed his eyes, remembering those painful afternoons the way he'd driven there without planning to drawn by a force he couldn't name or resist. The worst was Mother's Day, last year. Jordan continued, and Elena drew a sharp breath. I saw you at the flower shop, where Mom and I were buying flowers for Grandma's grave. You were buying the biggest bouquet. They had white roses and baby's breath, the same flowers Mom loves. But when you saw us through the window, you put them back and left. Elena's hand flew to her mouth. She had wondered who had been behind them in line, had felt eyes on her back, but when she'd turned around, no one was there. I wanted to run after you. Jordan said, tears finally spilling down his cheeks. I wanted to tell you that Mom still keeps dried white roses in her jewelry box from when you used to bring them to her. I wanted to say that maybe she'd like fresh ones again. But you were gone by the time I convinced myself to be brave. The room fell silent except for the sound of 3 people trying not to break completely. Lucas realized that while he'd been watching from a distance, his son had been watching him, 2 lonely souls circling each other like planets afraid to collide. That's when I knew I had to do something, Jordan said finally. Because we were all so sad, and none of us had to be. We were all missing each other, but nobody was brave enough to take the first step. Lucas felt exposed, dissected by a child who'd studied him like a specimen. The loneliness Jordan described was true. Lucas had built a life that looked successful from the outside, but felt hollow at its core. His days were filled with people, but his nights were empty. His calendar was packed, but his heart was vacant. I know about the drinking, too. Jordan continued quietly, and Elena's breath caught. The bottles in your desk drawer that you think nobody notices. The way you sit in your car for 10 minutes before going into your apartment, like you're trying to convince yourself to go home to a place that doesn't feel like home. The words landed like physical blows. Lucas had thought he was invisible, had believed his carefully constructed life was impenetrable. But a 12-year-old boy had seen through all of it, had watched him for months, and recognized the emptiness that money and success couldn't fill. Why? Elena asked, her voice barely audible, her hand protectively on Jordan's shoulder. Why would you do that to yourself? Jordan looked at his mother with eyes that held too much understanding, too much wisdom for someone who should have been worried about homework and soccer practice. Because I needed to know if he was happy without us, if throwing us away was worth it. He paused, swallowing hard, his young face serious. He's not happy, Mom. He's the loneliest person I've ever seen. The truth hung in the air like smoke from a fire that had been burning for 12 years. Lucas had spent those years building walls, acquiring things, climbing ladders that led nowhere meaningful. He'd convinced himself that success was worth the sacrifice, that his reputation was more valuable than his family. But his son had seen what Lucas couldn't admit, that every achievement felt hollow without someone to share it with. There's something else, Jordan said, his voice growing smaller, more vulnerable. Something I never told you, Mom. Elena knelt beside her son, her hands cupping his face with infinite tenderness. What is it, baby? I found your old journal, from when you were pregnant with me. Jordan's eyes filled with tears he'd been holding back. You wrote about how scared you were, but also how excited. You had names picked out, and you'd already bought a crib with the money you were saving for textbooks. Elena's composure finally cracked. Tears spilled down her cheeks as she remembered that hopeful, terrified girl she'd been, the one who had believed in fairy tales and happy endings. You wrote about how Lucas would hold your stomach and talk to me. How he said he couldn't wait to teach me to throw a baseball and read bedtime stories. Jordan's voice broke, and Lucas felt the echo of every moment he'd missed, every milestone he'd abandoned. You loved him so much, Mom. and I think he loved us too until he got scared." Lucas felt 12 years of justifications crumble like a house built on sand. He had loved them desperately, completely. He'd spent nights lying awake imagining bedtime stories, had secretly bought a baseball glove that he'd hidden in his closet, until guilt made him throw it away. But fear had been stronger than love reputation, more important than responsibility. "That's why I entered the scholarship competition." Jordan continued, his voice gaining strength from honesty. "Not because I needed the money. Mom's research is doing really well now. But because I knew it would get your attention, Dad. I knew you'd have to see me, and maybe you'd remember what you threw away." Elena stood slowly, her eyes never leaving her son's face. "You've been planning this for months." "Years," Jordan admitted, and Lucas saw the depth of his son's determination, the systematic way he'd worked to heal a family that had never existed. "Ever since I was old enough to understand that some kids don't have dads, not because they died, but because they chose to leave." Lucas felt the full weight of his son's words. This brilliant child had spent years engineering. This moment had studied him like a research project, had orchestrated their reunion with the precision of a scientist. Jordan had inherited Elena's intelligence and determination, but instead of using those gifts for personal advancement, he'd used them to try to heal a wound that had defined his entire life. "I don't need you to be my dad," Jordan said, looking directly at Lucas with eyes that held both hope and acceptance. "Mom has been both parents, and she's amazing. But I thought maybe you needed us more than we need you." Lucas stood slowly, his legs unsteady beneath him, as 12 years of carefully constructed walls crumbled around him. The expensive suit that had armored him in boardrooms felt like tissue paper now. The success he'd built his identity around seemed as substantial as smoke. Jordan's words echoed in his mind. "Maybe you needed us more than we need you." The truth of it was devastating and liberating all at once. This child, this magnificent, brilliant child, had seen right through the successful facade to the broken man underneath. Jordan wasn't here because he needed a father. He was here because he'd recognized that his father was drowning in a life that looked perfect but felt empty. "You're right." Lucas whispered the words, scraping his throat raw. "I am lonely. I've been lonely for 12 years, but I told myself it was the price of success. I told myself I made the right choice." He looked around his dining room, the crystal chandelier that had cost more than some people's cars, the artwork that impressed visitors but meant nothing to him, the symbols of achievement that felt hollow in the presence of real love. "I convinced myself that having everything meant I was happy, but everything without you was nothing." Elena remained standing beside Jordan, her hand protective on her son's shoulder. She wasn't ready to forgive. Lucas could see it in the careful distance she maintained, the way she watched him like she might need to shield Jordan from another disappointment. But there was something else in her eyes now, something that hadn't been there when she'd first walked through his door, recognition that this conversation was costing him something real. "I threw away the best thing that ever happened to me." Lucas continued, looking directly at Elena. "Not because I didn't love you. Because I loved you so much it terrified me. Because loving you meant choosing between you and everything I thought I was supposed to want, and I wasn't brave enough to choose love over fear." "And you chose wrong," Elena said simply, but her voice was gentler now, less sharp with anger. "I chose wrong." The admission felt like stepping off a cliff into unknown territory. "I chose a life that looked right on paper, but felt empty every single day. I chose reputation over responsibility, comfort over courage. I chose to be the kind of man my father wanted me to be, instead of the kind of man I wanted to be. Jordan moved closer to Lucas, his young face serious, with the weight of decisions that would shape all their futures. It's not too late to choose differently. Lucas knelt down, bringing himself to Jordan's eye level. Up close, he could see Elena's determination, in the set of the boy's jaw, her kindness, in the way he looked at people even when they'd hurt him. But there was something else, a strength that belonged entirely to Jordan, forged in the crucible of growing up without a father, but refusing to let that absence define him. "You don't owe me anything," Lucas said quietly, his voice thick with emotion. "Neither of you do. I forfeited my rights when I walked away. I gave up any claim to being your father the moment I chose fear over love. But if you'll let me, if there's any chance, I want to try to be the man you both deserved 12 years ago." Elena's eyes filled with tears again, but her voice remained steady, controlled by the scientist's mind that had carried her through impossible challenges. "It's not about what you want anymore, Lucas. It's about what's best for Jordan. He's not a second chance for you to feel better about yourself. He's a human being who deserves consistency, reliability, love that doesn't come with conditions." She took a deep breath, and Lucas could see her switching into the mode that had made her successful, analytical, methodical, protective. "If we do this, there are rules, non-negotiable rules that protect Jordan's heart and his future." "I know." Lucas looked at his son, really looked at him, seeing not just the child he'd abandoned, but the person Jordan had become despite that abandonment. "Jordan, I don't know how to be a father. I don't know if I can learn. I've spent 12 years building a life around avoiding responsibility, around choosing the easy path over the right one. But if you're willing to teach me, I promise I'll show up. Every time. No matter what." "What does that mean exactly?" Elena pressed her voice, taking on the tone she'd used in faculty meetings when colleagues made promises they couldn't keep. "Showing up when it's convenient, sending birthday cards, playing weekend dad, when your schedule allows." Lucas felt the weight of her skepticism earned through 12 years of doing everything alone. "It means I quit the country club. It means I stop caring what the Whitmores and the Ashfords think about my personal life. It means Jordan gets my phone number, and when he calls, I answer. Every time." Jordan studied his father's face with scientific precision, clearly inherited from his mother. "What about when I'm not cute anymore? When I'm 15 and angry and saying things that hurt your feelings? When I need help with homework you don't understand? Or when I want to study science instead of business?" Nor mood. The questions revealed a depth of thought that humbled Lucas. This child had considered every angle, every potential failure point. "Then I learn," Lucas said simply. "I learn science. I learn patience. I learn how to love someone even when they're angry at me, because that's what real parents do." Jordan studied his father's face with the intensity of someone who'd learned early that adults didn't always keep their promises. His young eyes seemed to catalog every expression, every micro-movement, searching for sincerity in a world where words often meant less than actions. "What about your reputation?" Jordan asked, and Lucas heard the echo of adult conversations, the residue of pain that had shaped this child's understanding of the world. "Your friends, all the things that were more important than us." The question cut deep because it went to the heart of everything. Lucas could make promises now in the emotion of this moment, but would he keep them when the real world intruded? When his colleagues asked uncomfortable questions, when society pages wondered why Lucas Bennett was suddenly involved with a woman and child he'd never mentioned, when the cost of choosing love became visible in quarterly reports and client relationships. "I'm 42 years old," Lucas said slowly, each word deliberate and measured. I've spent 20 years building a life that impressed other people, but meant nothing to me. 20 years of success that feels hollow of achievements that don't matter because there's no one to share them with. I don't want to spend the next 20 years the same way. Elena moved closer, her scientific mind clearly analyzing his words for truth, testing them against her experience of broken promises and shattered trust. This isn't a fairy tale, Lucas. You can't just show up and expect everything to be forgiven. Jordan and I have built a life together. A good life. A strong life. You don't get to disrupt that unless you're absolutely certain you can handle what comes next. I know. Lucas stood facing the woman who'd survived everything he'd put her through and emerged stronger, more accomplished, more magnificent than he'd ever imagined possible. I'm not asking to come back into your life, Elena. I know I destroyed that possibility when I chose cowardice over courage. I'm asking for the chance to be part of Jordan's future if he wants that, to be the father I should have been from the beginning. Jordan looked up at his mother, and Lucas saw an entire conversation pass between them in glances, years of shared struggle, mutual support, love that had been tested by hardship and proven unbreakable. They'd developed their own language over the years, these two who'd learned to be everything to each other. "Mom's been enough," Jordan said, finally, his voice carrying the loyalty of a child who'd watched his mother sacrifice everything for his well-being. "More than enough. But I've always wondered what it would be like to have both parents. Not together," he added quickly, seeing the alarm in Elena's eyes, understanding instinctively that some wounds never fully heal. "I know you're not going to get married or anything. But maybe I could have a dad and a mom who both love me even if they don't love each other anymore." Elena knelt beside Jordan, her hands framing his face with infinite tenderness. "Are you sure, baby, once we open this door, we can't close it again? If he disappoints you—" "He will," Jordan said, with the matter-of-fact wisdom of someone who'd learned early that people were imperfect, that love meant accepting flaws and choosing to care anyway. "But Mom, you taught me that we don't love people because they're perfect. We love them because they're ours, because we choose to see the best in them even when they can't see it in themselves." Lucas felt something break open in his chest, not the painful shattering of walls, but the tender opening of something that had been closed for too long. This child was offering him grace he didn't deserve, understanding he hadn't earned a chance to be better than he'd ever been. 3 months later, Lucas sat in the bleachers of Jordan's middle school, watching his son compete in the regional science fair. The gymnasium buzzed with nervous energy as 12-year-olds presented projects on everything from solar energy to plant genetics, their young voices mixing with the proud murmur of parents and the scratch of judges' pens on evaluation forms. Elena sat beside him, not close enough to suggest romance that bridge had been burned beyond repair, but near enough that they could share the quiet pride of watching their child explain complex DNA sequencing to a panel of judges. She'd pulled her hair back in a simple ponytail, and Lucas was struck by how young she looked when she smiled, how the years of struggle had marked her face with strength rather than bitterness. "He's been working on this for weeks," Elena said quietly, her voice carrying the warm pride of a mother who'd watched her child pursue knowledge with the same passion she'd once brought to her own studies. Testing different growth hormones on tomato plants, documenting every variable. Very advanced for his age. "He gets that from you," Lucas replied, meaning it with every fiber of his being. "The curiosity, the precision. I used to watch you study. Remember? The way you'd get lost in a problem until you solved it like the rest of the world disappeared, and there was only you and the truth you were chasing." Elena glanced at him, and for a moment, The careful distance between them softened into something that wasn't quite forgiveness, but wasn't hostility either. You remember that? I remember everything. Lucas kept his eyes on Jordan, who was now demonstrating his plant growth charts with the confidence of someone who'd inherited his mother's gift for teaching. I spent 12 years trying to forget, but I remember all of it. The way you hummed while you cleaned the books you left open on my kitchen counter, the way you looked when you talked about your dreams. They'd been careful these past months, awkward dinners, where Jordan did most of the talking, supervised visits to museums and baseball games, where Lucas learned to navigate the foreign territory of fatherhood. He'd discovered that Jordan liked strawberry ice cream, but was allergic to cherries, that he read 3 books a week, and devoured science documentaries like other kids consumed video games, that he wanted to be either a geneticist, like his mother, or an astronaut, depending on the day and the documentary he'd watched most recently. More importantly, Lucas had learned that being a father wasn't about genetics or even presence. It was about paying attention, about remembering that Jordan preferred his sandwiches cut diagonally and always saved the best part of his meal for last, about showing up to science fairs even when work was demanding, about listening to 12-year-old theories about time travel with the seriousness they deserved. He asked me something yesterday. Elena said, her voice careful, testing the waters of a conversation she wasn't sure she wanted to have. About forgiveness. Lucas felt his stomach tighten with familiar anxiety. What did you tell him? The truth. That forgiveness isn't the same as forgetting. That some wounds heal but leave scars that remind us to be more careful next time. Elena paused, watching Jordan adjust his presentation board with the meticulous care she'd taught him. But also that holding on to anger is like carrying stones. Eventually, your hands get too tired to hold anything else. Jordan caught sight of them in the stands and waved, his face bright with excitement that made Lucas's chest ache with love and regret. Lucas waved back, still amazed that this brilliant child was his, that he'd been given this unexpected second chance to be part of something greater than his own fears. I know you think I'm a saint, Elena said suddenly, her voice carrying a note of warning. Jordan does too. But I need you to understand something, Lucas. I didn't survive what you did to us by being perfect. I survived by being angry. Angry enough to prove you wrong, angry enough to build something better than what you offered. Lucas turned to look at her fully, seeing not just the accomplished woman she'd become, but the scared girl she'd been, the one who'd transformed devastation into determination. Are you still angry? Elena was quiet for a long moment, her eyes following Jordan as he fielded questions from the judges with poise that belied his age. I'm tired, she said finally. 12 years of carrying that anger, of being both mother and father, of proving over and over that I was worth more than you believed. It's exhausting to carry that much weight for that long. I'm sorry. Lucas said the words, feeling inadequate but necessary. I know that doesn't fix anything, but Elena, I am so deeply sorry for what I put you through. I know you are. She turned to face him, and Lucas saw something in her expression that hadn't been there before. Not forgiveness exactly, but a kind of peace, a laying down of weapons she'd carried too long. Jordan taught me something these past months. He said that families aren't just the people who never hurt you. Sometimes they're the people who hurt you and then spend the rest of their lives trying to make it right. On the floor below, Jordan's name was called as one of the regional winners. He looked up at them immediately, his face splitting into a grin that could have powered the school for a week. Elena and Lucas stood together, applauding their son's achievement, and for a moment they felt like what they'd never been, a family. He wants to have dinner together next week, Elena said as they watched Jordan receive his ribbon, already explaining his research to other contestants with the enthusiasm of a natural teacher. All three of us. Not a special occasion, just dinner. Like a normal family. And you're okay with that. Elena smiled, and Lucas saw not the girl she'd been, but the woman she'd become strong enough to risk love again. Wise enough to know the difference between healing and forgetting. I'm learning to be. Jordan says that normal doesn't mean perfect. It just means showing up day after day and choosing to love each other anyway. Healing doesn't always look like fairy tales. Sometimes it looks like three imperfect people choosing to love each other forward one difficult day at a time. Sometimes the greatest victories are measured not in what we gain, but in what we finally have the courage to let go. See, Lucas Bennett learned that redemption isn't a destination you arrive at, but a path you walk every day. Elena Reyes discovered that strength isn't about never needing help, but about knowing when to accept it. And Jordan Reyes taught them both that sometimes the greatest gift we can give someone is the chance to be better than they were yesterday. Some stories end with dramatic reunions and passionate kisses. This one ends with something quieter, but more profound. A family choosing each other not because it's easy, but because love is bigger than the mistakes we make. Share this video with someone who needs to know that it's never too late to choose love. Like if you believe in second chances, and subscribe for more stories that remind us what it means to be human. What story are you ready to heal in your own life? Chat.